Hi, this is Derek, and I'm going to make this video for week 6, and I'm a few days behind on this video, but I wanted to kind of reaffirm some of the things I've already discussed while you're working on writing towards the middle of your novel. So by now, hopefully you've started and hopefully written a few chapters, and that's great. Wherever you are in your book or in your novel, any progress that you've made is great progress. And if at all you're feeling stuck or frustrated or like you don't know what happens next, keep in mind that's totally a normal part of the process. You have to keep writing towards the next part where you get stuck, and you don't solve those problems until you're right there in front of them, because you can't see everything going into it. And I picked this image. I hope I'm not reusing some of the images that I've used earlier, but I picked this image because you can see that she's really stuck. Like, she's climbed this journey, she's made some progress, but now she's facing some really big challenges. So you can kind of see it as, maybe she's trying to get way over here, but when she started the journey, she didn't know how big it was or how far she was going or what she would be up against. She couldn't have foreseen like all the lightning storms, or like this massive guy on the horizon. But she's progressed to the point where she can now see the bigger picture and see what she's up against. And she's also kind of in a precarious place where going back to the beginning isn't going to be very easy either. So we're really writing towards this middle point where we've already hopefully passed the point of no return, but a lot of that was accidental. It wasn't really a choice. So the midpoint is when she actually has enough information to see what's mostly going on and the true extent of the stakes, and understands enough about the world to make a more informed personal decision about what to do. And I threw in this little quote here, hook, line, and sinker, because the first 25% that we talked about in the last video is really just about hooking attention of the readers, which is why you don't want to put in too much information. You want to focus more on the action and the interesting scenes and characters. But now we're going into the Act 2, which is more like the line. And the interesting thing about the line is it's more about the give and take. So you don't want to just hook really quickly and then, I don't actually know what sinker means because I'm not really a fisherman. I'm pretty sure it means something like adding the weights to the line so that the line goes deeper into the water. I'll do some research so that by the time I get to Act 3, maybe I'll have some more thoughts on what that sinker part is, which would be like an emotional depth. But the line thing is interesting because I think it's really a give and take, and you're letting out more line. So rather than just like hooking the fish and reeling them in really quickly, because the problem is if you push too hard or you pull too hard, the fish will get spooked and break away. So with the line, you give them the illusion of freedom. You kind of let the line out. You're patient, you're slow, you develop it, you give them more space because you know that when they feel kind of more comfortable, they're not going to give up. It's almost like, the hook, the fish might nibble. They might bite a little bit. If this is a metaphor about your readers, they're reading a few pages, they're lukewarm, they're halfway interested, but they're not fully committed yet. And so with the line, you're allowing the fish to feel like they might get away with it. You allow them to taste the treat or the bait a little bit to really feel like they're going to have a satisfying meal, which makes it much more likely that they will follow you through to the ending. I'm not sure if my metaphor is making any sense, but that's kind of what I was trying to think about it. I used to go fishing for crawdads, which is interesting because with a fish, you're actually hooking them and they can't get away. But when you're fishing for crawdads, you put a hot dog on a piece of string and you lower it down, and the crawdads will bite onto it and they won't let go, even if you pull it up out of the water, and put them in a bucket or something. There's nothing really keeping them. The crawdads are just ferociously hanging on because they want to get away with the bacon or the hot dog. So it's a weird metaphor, but it's kind of about how you want your readers to be so committed that they don't let go, so that when you eventually get to that final climax or the final battle scene or the resolution, they're really invested in the emotional payout. So you've got their attention and you want to get them to your ending, but the line is that second act, which is more of a give and take, which is going to have some slow scenes and some fast scenes. It's not all just going to be action and violence, but if you do it right, this is the time to deepen the emotional impact. So that's kind of what I'm going to start talking about today. And so if you remember, Act 1 was Hero in Ordinary World. Act 2, the way that my strategy is mapped out, I just have Act 2 Part A and Act 2 Part B, which is a little bit messy, but I liked it a little bit better than a 4-act play with Act 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's less common and might be a little bit confusing. But today we're just talking about this part, which is exploring the new world and writing towards the midpoint. So I'm just going to talk about some things that might happen in these scenes, in these chapters. And so the first slide I've named Seeking Purpose, because the protagonist will be looking for answers, but they'll also be looking for a really personal conviction or point. The first half, and I actually just changed this to the first act, was to hook interest, and we focus on what's actually happening. So I said you should try to avoid adding in too much information, too much backstory, too much why or who. You don't want to give the answers too early because that'll kill all the suspense and intrigue. The next part is, why is this happening to me? So this is the really personal part. It's not just what's happening. And you might remember earlier I said that the first act was about the what's happening. The second act is about the who is behind everything, and the final act is about the why. The final answers about the backstory and the motivation all comes later. So it might sound a little bit confusing to have this other why here, but this is just, why is this happening to me? I should probably bold this part. So there's a little bit more of an introspective focus where they are wondering how they fit into this new role and this new world. And there are going to be some positive scenes and some negative scenes. So I'm trying to kind of break those up in the next 2 slides. So she, I'm going to say she for my protagonist because a lot of my pictures are she's. But the main focus of this the first half of Act 2 is going to be trying to feel at home or making themselves at home, and also finding answers. So part of it is just getting used to the new world, learning the rules, learning how it works, if this is a magical system or if they have a new job as a police detective or whatever. There's going to be some things that they are not familiar with. It could be a new job, even if it's a new relationship, even if it's just a new situation where 90% of their normal life is the same, but this 10% is the stuff that really matters, where everything is new. There's going to be a lot of new, strange, something to get used to, which is going to make them feel threatened or frustrated. So they're going to be fighting for stability or normalcy or acceptance. And I think this acceptance is really important, because a lot of the negative feelings are going to be about this lack of acceptance. When people are judging them or bullying them, they may feel like there's an authority figure or new peers who are looking down at them. There might be a bullying aspect, or even just like when Harry Potter first goes to Hogwarts, the adults are either cold and standoffish. Even Dumbledore is really pretty cold to Harry and doesn't explain things very well. There's a lot of times where he could have shared crucial information but just doesn't. And then you also have someone like Snape, who is actively antagonistic and mean to him, and we don't find out until way, way later in the series about all of the backstory between Snape and Harry's parents. So even if the characters don't want to belong to this new world yet, they still may feel like they have to fight for acceptance or approval. They might be struggling for control or autonomy or understanding. Maybe in their normal world, they've always had a sense of control or power, and they are now kind of adrift in this unfamiliar landscape with these new peers or friends. They might be very capable in normal circumstances, but they're dealing with things that are new to them or that they don't understand, that they have to learn. So they're probably at a disadvantage already. And so a lot of this is, like I mentioned, introspective, and you want to balance it between things that are actually happening. So you want to be really careful about not just piling on this stuff. There should be a little bit of this, but a lot of this is really going to show up towards the end of the first half of Act 2, which is the midpoint, which is that big introspective moment. So before you get there, a lot of this stuff will be developed in the action, and they may not stop to process it until the midpoint. So there's going to be some small dangers and challenges, small trials and quests, motivations, and then some discovery goals, which is finding out what's happening and why. So there might be tasks related to them learning how to get along or survive in this new environment. Maybe it's learning their powers or learning the rules or the role of their job, or even just getting to know the other characters who are, in their environment. If it's something like an academy setting where they have to go to school and they have, tasks, projects, homework to do. So basically like the normal stuff of the new world that's still difficult for them because they're not familiar with it, but isn't actually dangerous or violent. And at the same time, there's a larger issue that's slowly being discovered with an active danger, antagonist, threat, or risk, which maybe people don't want to talk about or share too easily, so they have to do a little bit of sleuthing. You always want to make it difficult for them to discover information. You don't want it just to be handed to them. So on top of these small trials and quests that are normal in this new environment or world, they also need larger questions about what's going on that are not being answered, which will force them to take some risks and try to find their own answers. They may also be grappling with threats, risks, and seeking a solution. And so a large part of the first half of Act 2 is going to be dealing with issues of self-worth. So maybe when they come into this new world, they are not really fully invested. They don't want to be here. They don't really understand what's happening or what's at stake or why it matters. They probably feel like they don't belong. And what you need to do in the first half of Act 2 is move them from, I don't belong here and this isn't my problem, to I'm going to participate in this conflict. You do want to show more conflict happening. Even in scenes where there's not any danger, you could still have those 3 points of conflict going on in every scene. But like I said, you really want to put them on defense by challenging their sense of self-worth, by making things difficult for them. They're not good at this stuff. This is all harder than they expected. Nobody here trusts them or values them or respects them. So by putting them in kind of this position of weakness, you kind of get them to want to fight for approval. In terms of story questions, they're probably trying to figure out what's happening, but like I mentioned, in Act 1, they're really thinking about what's happening, and a lot of those what questions will be answered by about this point. Once they start the point of no return, at least some of the basics, like what's happening questions, will be answered. So the questions will deepen and change more to who is doing this and how do we stop it. So some of the stakes have been revealed, so they know what some of the motivations behind the plot events that happened earlier in the novel are, at least a little bit, but they may not know who is behind it yet. But they might be able to take proactive steps to stop what's happening by figuring out whoever it is, what are they going to need next. Like, we don't know who is behind this, we don't know what they want, but they did this thing, so if they're trying to do this, then they're going to need this other thing. So they can kind of work backwards, and they can, even if they don't know who is really behind it, they can try to do something to take steps to rectify the information. But at the same time, the protagonist is probably thinking, how do I get out of this? How can I get back to normal? And they may be thinking, you've got the wrong person, I don't belong here. They might be thinking, am I enough, or am I good enough? Even possibly after someone tells them about their unique role or identity. Often in young adult novels, they'll find out that, secretly one of their parents was involved in this world that they're just finding out about for the first time. But before that happens, before those reveals about their true identity happens, they have to be questioning their true identity and asking whether or not they really belong here. And so in this quarter of the novel, you want to be trying to move them towards understanding and conviction. So they probably have to have like an identity crisis and really not understand why they're here or why they're experiencing these things or what any of this has to do with them, why they're special. They probably think they're just ordinary people. And probably around the midpoint, they will get some piece of information, either trivia or backstory, about their actual true identity. Or they will just feel like they've developed enough relationships or emotions to decide that they want to continue operating in this world. And so they have conviction because instead of being a stranger, now they are part of this new culture. And that means they have something to lose. In the beginning, they don't care about the stakes or the risks because this isn't their world. These aren't their friends. So a big part of this section is just going to be deepening those relationships, showing some happy scenes, some trivial scenes, laughter, joking around, so that they will kind of move from a position of, I don't belong here, I don't have any friends here, to maybe this is someplace I can belong. Maybe they don't totally feel like they deserve it yet or they belong here yet, but they're starting to feel safe or comfortable with this new environment and maybe showing enough potential that they feel like this could be the right place for them. And when you're talking about really deep sense of satisfaction or belonging, you don't want to make it too easy. If everybody's just friendly and nice in the beginning, they don't have to work for anything, it doesn't have that satisfying emotional impact. So the reason that you start them off at a disadvantage, you make them work really hard, you make them feel like they don't belong, is that gradually when people begin to respect them, when they begin to earn some respect, begrudgingly or otherwise, it's going to matter so much more to them. It's going to mean so much more to them. And then that's when you really get that deep sense of conviction. And this is also what's going to deepen the emotional impact of your novel. Someone asked me, and I made some videos about the questions and answers that I got earlier, and one of them was just how do I make a deeper dramatic or emotional impact. So I called this slide Twist the Knife, and we'll probably talk more about this again during one of the editing phases in month 3, because a lot of this stuff, the really deep emotional impact stuff, you really shouldn't worry about until later, only because it's difficult to figure out what's supposed to happen this early. When you're still just working on the rough draft and you're just putting the pieces together, most likely you're not really going to get to the core emotional conflict of your book until you already have the basic, rough draft, what happens version plotted already or figured out. But at the same time, you might start to feel like your middle section is a little bit unbalanced. Maybe you have too much action or too much slow scene, so you might be looking for some inspiration or motivation about what other kinds of scenes you can include. And so that's why I included this slide, and I'll kind of go through it sort of quickly. But you want to show that the world is worth fighting for, or that she has friends to care about. This could be some of the friendships or relationships from the first quarter of the novel or from the ordinary world. This could be like parent figures or grandparents or brothers and sisters, or it could be new friends or relationships from the new world. When you're talking about drama, emotional drama, that's always going to be emotional bonds. So you really want to focus on, it's going to be the friends, the family, friendships, but I should have said relationships or significant others. And I should have also included something like frenemies or bullies, because often it's the people who make life difficult for you that force more of an emotional impact or change. You're probably going to remember that one really sharp comment, or people talking about you behind your back, or that one time your babysitter snapped at you because you were doing something. So you want to be developing these emotional bonds. But the thing about relationships is that they take time to develop. So you can't just throw people together and have them have nothing but happy times and have a satisfying or challenging emotional relationship. You kind of have to show episodes happening over and over again. And this could be being nice or caring or having someone look out for you, but only if it's being contrasted with feelings of feeling bad, terrible, alone, weak, useless, ignored, or unappreciated. So these are all the things, going back to the last slide, you want to try to make your protagonist feel bad in this section, because the worse that they feel, the more important it's going to be when people are actually nice and caring. Even if it's just a little small act of kindness, even if it's just a little look, it doesn't have to be that someone like sticks up for you or defends you, although it could be that. Often these nice caring moments can even be kind of secretive. Like if you find that maybe someone's been doing something really nice for you, but you didn't know, and then later on it's revealed that this person who you thought was being mean or cold was actually looking out for you the whole time, that can have a really strong emotional impact. During this section, you could have them screwing up or doing things on accident in their struggle to prove themselves. But there could also be laughter and levity, which shows that the world is worth saving. So I know I've said that you don't want scenes where everybody's just sitting around and having fun. And that's sort of true, but you can have a few scenes that are fun as long as they also have a really great scene description. If they're really interesting scenes where you're getting to know the characters' personalities and where there's some deepening of conflict. Often the conflict doesn't happen until like the very end of the scene or the end of the chapter. So it could be a party scene where it's all fun and games until, the very end when suddenly something really negative happens. And that's a really powerful way to contrast. Whenever you're going to have something negative happen, first you fill it with laughter and jokes, and touching moments and nice stuff, so that the impact of the negative thing is a lot stronger and more sudden. This could also be where you have some heartwarming or heart-wrenching backstory. So like I mentioned earlier, you don't want too much backstory in the first quarter of the book, because they shouldn't really be asking the questions, because they're not threatened enough by the circumstances, or they just don't care. They don't want anything to do with this new world or this new adventure. They just want to go home. But now that they're stuck here and they're slowly getting to know the other characters, they'll probably be asking some questions. And this is a time when you can reveal some backstory about the world or about the other characters, mostly to endear the readers and the protagonist to the new characters. But you want to try to be careful to make sure that the backstory actually matters. So the backstory matters if it's going to influence any of the characters' actions, and that the actions that those characters are going to take influences the outcome of the plot. So maybe, later on, you're going to have one of your characters do something to establish the motivations or the personality for that character earlier, to make sure that it's believable that they would do those things. This would be a place where you could introduce a backstory that lets readers understand a little bit more about them. And the reason that you add backstory is so that readers care about your characters. Because if they don't care about your characters, they're not going to care what happens. They're not going to feel, maybe there's a really dangerous or violent scene where one of the characters' life is at risk. Readers aren't going to care unless they know and like those characters. So the more that you can deepen their backstory, the more touching it is, the more that readers are going to care about the action scenes when those characters are threatened. With backstory, you want to try to make sure that when you reveal backstory, it's related to the plot in terms of the questions that people would be asking. Basically, there's a reason for the backstory to come out. So not just the characters are sitting around volunteering all of this really personal, private story about themselves, because people don't usually share, especially when they're really personal, vulnerable, emotional stories. People don't share that stuff unless they have a reason to. So maybe if your protagonist is feeling really bad, one of the other characters will share a story to try to make them feel better. Or if the protagonist is asking really challenging questions, or just grumbling or frustrated about the way that they're being treated, this is a time when another character could provide some backstory, which gives some context about the world or about the other characters, while also maybe making them more sympathetic also. The other thing about backstory is that the reader should be learning the backstory at the same time the protagonist is learning the backstory. So if possible, you want the backstory to be out loud in a conversation, or maybe it's something that she's reading in a book or discovering somehow, but the reader should discover the stuff at the same time that the protagonist is also discovering the stuff. You want to try to avoid just the narrator divulging the information directly to the readers when the characters already know it, or when the characters don't know it yet, or sometimes it'll get messy where sometimes there'll be a big backstory info dump because the narrator or the writer thinks the readers need all this information to understand what's happening. So there's 3 or 4 paragraphs of backstory, and the reader learns it first, and then after all of that, the character discovers that same backstory and they actually shocked or surprised and they're like, oh my god, I didn't know. And that can feel really fake or forced because it comes at a different time, so it just doesn't feel smooth. I'll also comment that this is still the first rough draft, so don't over edit this or overthink it. If you want to dump 3 paragraphs of backstory, that's totally fine. Whatever ideas you have, get them down on the page. If you don't have to stick to the scene that you're writing, if you get inspired, or if you notice that like something needs to happen here, it's totally fine to add a little note to yourself and say like, add a sympathetic backstory here, or figure out why this character would say something. You can add little notes to yourself and go back and fill them in later, or if you get distracted and you want to spend a few hours writing 3 pages of backstory, that's okay too. Everything is okay when you're just trying to get down the basics of what happens and why it happens. Every idea is kind of a good idea, and then later when you're polishing, you can go back and fix up the delivery. And so finally, small words, deeds, or sayings can have a big impact when remembered later. So the other part of this process, and this is the first half of the second act, some of this stuff may seem like little trivial moments that don't really matter, but this could be the stuff that they miss later. So right now, the stakes are not very high. There's not a lot of big danger. They probably, let me go back here, they probably have had a first battle, so they know there's some danger in the world, but maybe they haven't personally felt the deep effects of pain and loss yet. This is still kind of just information. They're starting to become aware of the dangers, but they haven't really experienced it yet. So they may have some happy, fun times or levity or jokes. They may be starting to enjoy this new world, so that by the time they get to the midpoint, they're willing to fight for it once it gets threatened. And later, when they actually start to feel the effects of real pain or loss, they will probably look back at these moments with regret or fond reflection. So maybe if one of the characters dies, or even if one of the characters betrays them, or they used to be friends and now they're enemies, or whatever, they can be looking back at these earlier moments. Also, some of these earlier moments can be reframed through a different lens later and have a profoundly different meaning. So what's common in young adult books is maybe they will have a saying or a catchphrase or like a insider's joke that they repeat a couple times, which is just kind of silly or meaningless. And then at the end of the novel, or close to the end of the novel, when now there's this pathos and passion and angst and emotion, that same little phrase can have profound emotional meaning or impact. So that's basically all I wanted to say in this week's presentation. But let me talk a little bit about the novel I'm working on now, because I'm actually editing this part of the novel. I'm almost to the midpoint. So I can give some examples. They may not be the best examples in the world, but I think they might kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. And again, I will say that I've been through this novel many times already. This is not the rough draft. This is the final polish where I'm going through and doing the editing. So a lot of these, like most of the really great stuff, the really powerful, emotional stuff that's going to make the biggest impact, you may not discover it until much later in the editing phases. But if I give you some examples, it might help you just think about how to tie things together a little bit more. So the first example, the current mission, my protagonist sneaks out of this safe haven to go out and try to find a map in an old library. She's with a side character who's kind of like a young scientist girl. And they basically just want to sneak out and grab this map from where this scientist girl used to live and then get back to safety as quick as possible. But they have a run-in with a bear, and then they get attacked. In the end, they end up exposing the entire community who are living underground. So now they all have to be evacuated. The side character's name is April. So they're basically just going to where she used to live. But I could add a lot of character depth to her by showing the place that she used to live in. So I have her in an abandoned library. She was growing up all by herself. This is like a post-apocalyptic world. And she was living in the book return space, like under the library where you put the book in the slot and it goes into the little box. She set up a little house in that slot, and she was living by herself. And her backstory is, she was living by herself. She read all the books. She's self-educated. She had a cat at one point, but then the vampires came, they killed her cat, and that was like the end of her childhood. So that's already kind of a brutal backstory. And all I did today was make it a little bit more tragic by adding a stuffed pink elephant in that little room to show that, she really grew up as a child alone in these brutal circumstances. But now that I have that set up to deepen the conflict or to deepen the drama later, in book 3, I'm going to have my protagonist find a stray cat or a kitten or something. My protagonist has gone off on this big mission to save the world and left April behind to work on the vaccine or the cure, but she'll come back with a gift, which will be a kitten, and that'll be part of the early part of the 3rd book. Another example is another side character who is Beatrice, and she's an older woman who lost her daughter years earlier. She's kind of hanging out with my protagonist and looking out for her a little bit. My protagonist gets injured, and then when the location to this secret hideout is revealed, the vampires attack and they will kill Beatrice, which is already kind of brutal because it's a side character that we already got to know a little bit. And again, like, to make that character's death really matter, I can show a little more backstory. So there's a few little threads. Earlier there in book 1, there was a fight between a couple of sort of werewolves, and in my stories, werewolves are shifters. So Beatrice's husband went to fight with the rebels and then disappeared, and Beatrice helps my protagonist to escape, and they kind of escape together. But earlier, my protagonist had killed a few of those werewolves before she knew that they were actually human shifters. So later, when Beatrice says, I lost my husband, he hasn't come home yet, my protagonist can wonder whether that wolf that she killed was actually Beatrice's husband. And we don't really figure that out for sure. It's just kind of like a little bit of potential conflict or drama between them. But I really wanted to heighten the guilt. My protagonist is already going to feel really terrible because she basically brought down the vampires on this secret hideout of resisting humans. But I wanted to make it more personal. So when my protagonist is injured, I have Beatrice isn't even really there, but I have somebody give her a little poultice of herbs. So it's just a little sack of herbs for vitality that Beatrice arranged for her because she was injured, which at the time doesn't really mean anything. It's just kind of a nice little thing. But later, when Beatrice gets killed, it's because she was outside picking more herbs for my protagonist. So my protagonist can see, if, number one, if I didn't go out and risk everything to get this map, then nobody would be in danger. But number two, Beatrice shouldn't even have been outside. She went outside to get more herbs for me because I was injured. So there's all these conflicting senses of guilt. It just makes the death more tragic. And then a final point I added about Beatrice, she basically, the vampires are up on a building and they just drop her off the edge of the building and she dies that way. But right after that, like within an hour, one of the other side characters goes back. There's also a vampire ally who's been held captive or prisoner. She's kind of a good vampire. And so she gets rescued while the other vamps are coming to destroy the compound. She escapes. And so I have this other little piece of conflict where, you know, she's been held prisoner, she's starving, so they take her to feed on Beatrice because it's a fresh, warm body and she needs sustenance because she hasn't fed for weeks. So it's a really pragmatic, practical thing where she's, you know, Beatrice is already dead, but it's also really horrific, especially for the other side characters who care about Beatrice, and she just died this senseless, violent death, and then this new vampire fed on her. They already don't trust each other. There's already a lot of conflict between them. So this little group who escape together have all of this really deep emotional conflict. And so one more example, I haven't actually put in this book yet, and I'm not really sure that I will, but I want to do this idea where my protagonist likes to peel her apples. So it's a really simple thing. Maybe a few times in earlier scenes when they're just eating breakfast or dinner, either my protagonist or one of the side characters will just, you know, slice her apples and then peel them so that the apple slices are cut up and peeled. That's how I like my apples. It's just a really nice thing when somebody else does something small for you. So one of my characters would do that a few times. Maybe somebody would remark or comment on how that's kind of strange, like they can't just eat the apple by biting into it, they have to prepare it the way that they like it. Or it could be something like cutting the crust off their sandwiches, or just a little thing. But then later in the book, probably after some of the trauma, one of the other characters, maybe the love interest or just another side character, will do that small act of kindness for them without asking. Like they just noticed that that's the way that they like their apples prepared, and they just did that. And it's just such a small thing, but it can just have a really deep emotional impact that somebody else cares enough about you to notice, you know, the small things, how you do things, and then to take the time to do things the way that you like them. Even though it's a really little thing, it can have a deeper meaning. Like rather than just confessing feelings of love or friendship, having someone do a small act of kindness like that can represent a lot of unspoken feelings. So that's it for this week's video. I hope you can keep writing and get to the midpoint. It's, again, okay if you don't have all this figured out. It's okay if you've got a lot of gaps or spaces in your manuscript. The first draft is really just going to be rough notes about what is happening. If you want to write some just fun scenes where it's just cool and interesting, they're flying on dragons or they're playing Quidditch or whatever, that's totally fine, even if you don't know what the conflict or the plot development is yet. You can just write the fun scenes, and later during edits you can go back and make them relevant, because you don't want a fun scene where it's not relevant at all. But like I mentioned, having a fun scene can be really relevant in retrospect later. So it's okay to just have some, like, you know, nothing important is happening. It's just kind of a lighter, more fun scene, as long as you're showing that the world is worth fighting for. So that's really what this section is about. It's just showing that your protagonist is going to like living in this world enough to fight for it. Your readers are going to care enough about these characters and this world to care what happens later. So it's really important in the second act to build out the depth of your world and the depth of your characters to make readers care about what's going to happen in the third act when you actually have the bigger stakes and the conflict.